So today, class, we're talking about podcasting, something near and dear to my heart since I love to podcast. Now, the term podcasting first came when they mixed iPod plus broadcasting. Now, we don't really have iPods anymore, but we still call them podcasting. Some people will say pod is personal online delivery, but really it came from the iPod. So there's two types of podcasting. There's audio podcasting and video podcasting. Now, sometimes you'll hear the term vodcasting for video podcasting, but they're really, really close because here's what happens. This is my podcast, but I have a still picture and it just plays the audio, and this is my YouTube channel. Well, technically this is a video, but it's kind of an audio podcast. Don't let it confuse you. Most people will say audio podcast or video podcast. But see, sometimes people record a video podcast and then rip the audio off and just release that. So video and audio, it kind of is pretty close together there. Now this is a list of all of the different genres of podcasts that the iTunes store has, and lots of different top charts. They produce top charts. Usually my show, The 10-Minute Teacher, will show up in the top charts for the K-12 iTunes store. And you can see that this is the iTunes for my particular show, but you don't have to just have it on iTunes. There's lots of other places where this show can appear. It can be on Spotify, it can be just all kinds of places on the internet, Stitcher, lots of other places that you can grab the podcast. Now you also need something called a podcatcher. And you can see right here, this is the Apple Podcast app. It's getting a little better, but it doesn't have all the features of the other podcatcher apps. Like I use iCatcher, and it lets me make little playlists so I can customize basically my own radio when I'm listening to it in the car or in my office. Now there's lots of podcatchers out there. The podcast app, like I said, Overcast, Castro, iCatcher, Downcast, Spotify actually added podcasts just recently. Player FM, Podcast Addict, and even more. So if you really get into this, or if you have a commute, or you like to listen to things like I do, you want to grab a podcatcher and start subscribing to podcasts. So this is an example of the podcast host that I use. So I use one called Libsyn, which is a fairly inexpensive, very robust and powerful way to host your podcast. You can see that, the average podcast will actually have about 200 downloads per episode, but some of the more popular ones have far more than that as well. So here are the steps for setting up a podcast. First, you have your topic. What's your genre? What's your format? Then you will record. So you have your microphone. You'll use Audacity, GarageBand. I actually record on Skype using something called Ecamm call recorder that will record it for me. And then you definitely want to have royalty-free music, and that means that's music that you could share. You can't just go rip music off the internet and put it on your podcast. Then you'll edit it in Audacity, Adobe Audition, or GarageBand. We'll learn more about that. You upload it to a host, and like I said, I use Libsyn. And then you'll syndicate or release the show, and then finally you'll market and promote, and you'll tell people about the podcast. Now, for our class, we are going to first of all start off by listening to some podcasts, letting you analyze it. What's the name? How long is the podcast? Who's the host? Do they have a host and guest model? Or is it some of those fun fiction podcasts like Serial that people like to listen to that's actually dramatic? We'll look at the pre-roll and the post-roll. We'll see if it doesn't have a theme song, and how does that work? How do they interest people or hook people at the beginning? Do they have an outtake, which is just a little clip from the podcast? Or do they have some sort of teaser, which is a special thing they record at the beginning to make you want to listen to the show? Think of it as just trying to hook you in and bring you into the show. Who is the target for the show, and what's the frequency of the show? The best shows are reliable. My show is 5 days a week, every weekday, except spring break, summer, and a few vacation times off, just like teachers have. But what is the syndication of the podcast? So we're getting ready to check out some new podcasts, and here we go.
Never stop learning.